The polls are crazy. Welcome to this episode of Kennedy Saves the World. So polling is such an interesting phenomenon because it's hard to figure out where this election is going to go. It's been so confusing because every time you hear about new polling data, it's like, well, Harris is up by 15, or, well, there you go. Trump is winning all 17 battleground states by 10 points. But we don't really know what's going on, and I'm not sure why that is. Ever since 2016, polling has been extraordinarily difficult, and I don't envy the people who are trying to get someone somewhere, particularly in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, on the phone or via text to answer questions about how they feel about these particular candidates and these issues. But it is so necessary because we are addicted to the drama of the closeness of this race and the last few presidential contests that we have seen. Joining me now, the person whose life work it is to come up with models and algorithms and ways of gleaning exactly what voters are thinking. He is the director of the Fox News Decision Desk. It is my good friend, Arnon. Arnon, welcome to Kennedy Saves the World.
Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So you have had quite a time here recently. This has been a really close race. Is this historically close?
You know, 2000, it was decided by 537 votes in Florida. Mm-hmm. So it probably isn't going to be that close.
Then? Has it been since Florida?
This is probably the closest race in the polls.
Okay.
But the reality is every race this century, with the exception of 2008, with the Obamas and, Obama running with all the momentum he had, and at a time when the Republicans, had the Great Recession in 2008, with the exception of that race, every presidential race has been incredibly close.
Yes.
And that's the America we live in, which is an America that is closely divided. Mm-hmm. In a sense, we're closely divided nationally, although locally we tend to live with people who totally agree with us and don't understand how can anyone be voting for her or for him.
Yes.
But that's the way America is.
Yes, and they're confounded because, you have these candidates who either hate Donald Trump so much. It's not that they really love Kamala Harris. I don't know too many Harris Democrats, but I know a lot of Democrats who cannot stand Donald Trump. And they cannot for the life of them understand why anyone would vote for him or support him and go to his rallies. There is such a disconnect there between how I feel about Donald Trump and how other people could possibly give him any support.
I think that's exactly right. And more important, this is an election about Donald Trump. And the 2020 election was also about Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in our poll, 2/3 of Americans said they voted because of Donald Trump. Those were people who either voted for Donald Trump because they liked Donald Trump or people who voted for the other candidate. He happened to be named Joe Biden, mm-hmm. but that's irrelevant. They happened to vote for the other candidate because he was not Donald Trump.
Yes.
And I wouldn't be surprised if on the, election night in our Fox News voter analysis, we see that number is even higher.
Okay.
That many people, everyone's going to do.
Who does that benefit, the higher number?
That's a really good question. And I think that all year long, I've said this election is about Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Don't pay any attention to the number that whoever's running against Trump is getting. Just pay attention to the number Trump has gotten.
So when I spoke to you about 6 weeks ago, I asked you what would it take for him to win, and you said he has to stay at 48%. Has he stayed at 48%?
Not only has he stayed at 48%, but there is some evidence that he's grown. Mm-hmm. So the Fox News poll had him at 50%. Quinnipiac, which is a pretty respected pollster, also had him at 50%. So his number, which everyone assumed the ceiling on Donald Trump was below 50, it ain't happening anymore. Right now, we're seeing national polls that have him above 48 and at 50. Which and yes, if I am a betting person, I'd rather be Donald Trump at 48 or 50 than being Kamala Harris.
What polls give her panic? When you see this stuff every day, when you see the Fox News polling and some of the other polling data, what do you think worries her campaign?
I think every bit of the polling worries the campaign right now. In the public polling, I think nationally, the fact that he gets close to 50 is a bad sign for Kamala Harris. Mm-hmm. And more important, when you look at the state polls, a lot of them are turning out, sort of showing Trump growing in states like Nevada, states like Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And the ball game is about the Electoral College, and the
Yes.
ball game of these polls suggests that Trump is very well positioned. Another thing that should be giving pause to the Kamala Harris campaign is the early vote. Now, it's really hard to read tea leaves in the numbers in the early vote, but it does seem that the Republicans, in 2020, they discouraged people from voting early. They discouraged people from voting by mail. Now they're encouraging it, and it does show some evidence that they're actually benefiting from that encouragement. And many of the numbers from the states would give pause, or even more so, to the Harris campaign.
Yes, and it was a little bit of a surprise in 2020 that Republicans didn't lean into that. And, that they were kind of demonizing the vote by mail or early voting process when it was so productive and successful for Democrats. But when
without question,
yeah.
If the Republicans had been pushing mail-in vote,
Yeah.
They would have won in 2020.
So Joe Biden, if I'm not mistaken, he was up by about 6 points in Georgia at this point in 2020, and he won by a quarter point. Why is that? Why was there a disparity in the polling data versus the actual data?
We're going to be hearing in the next 2 weeks about the Democratic ground game, which is about their ability, which they've been investing in for basically 2 years, to make sure that they know the names and phone numbers and addresses of everyone who they think is a supporter of theirs, and that they make sure those people vote. That's their ground game, getting people to vote. And that the Republicans seem to have no real ground game. Actually, the Republicans have a very strong ground game.
And how is it different?
The ground game is named Donald Trump. Okay. Donald Trump has enormous appeal to a base of voters who are typically, they're not the kind of people who absolutely vote every time. But when Trump's on the ballot, they come out. And that's what we saw in 2016. It's one of the reasons the polls were wrong in 2016. It's what we saw in 2020. It's why in Georgia, the polls were saying Biden was going to win Georgia by 6%. He won it by only less than 1%. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see it again this time around, that Trump gets his folks out, even though he doesn't have an organized game again.
So what I've noticed, and this is anecdotal, just talking to people, whether it's doing shows, I did a show in Pennsylvania, talking to some of my neighbors in Southern California, people who before didn't talk about their support for Donald Trump are very vocal about it now. Why did that change? Was it the assassination attempt? Was it the feeling that there was injustice in 2020? Is it the economic environment? What is that?
I think it's that it's easier to be opposed than to be in favor.
Yeah.
Because anyone who's president gets, the slings and arrows, if you will, of attacks.
Yes.
And so sometimes if you're a supporter of whoever is in the White House or is in charge, you may be a little shy about it.
Yeah.
And I think
But they were in 2016 as well.
And in 2016, I think there was a sense from the media that this guy was a bit of a clown. He was a TV host, nothing more than that.
Yes.
But I kind of liked him, so I'm not going to tell you that I actually kind of like him.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile that? How do you, as someone who figures out the algorithms and the models for polling, how do you account for that for people who don't necessarily pick up the phone if they're supporting Trump? Do you try and reach more Trump voters?
I mean, I think they're a pre-election pollster, and I work with many of them. In order to sort of make sure you're getting the right kind of voter, looks, for a couple of things. Number one, you try to make sure you have enough Republicans in your sample, and if that's correct. Number two, you try to make sure you have enough people who recall that they voted for Donald Trump. You don't necessarily weight by that. Some do. I know that Fox does not. You don't weight it by that, but you do look at it and use it as a guardrail. And then the other thing you look at is, sort of questions about was Joe Biden legitimately elected, which is a method of figuring out, do you have sufficient numbers of Trump voters, and that's what the tools you use. On election night, what we're using primarily in the swing states, the thing we're going to be focused on is actual numbers of votes, and looking at those numbers and seeing, is candidate X, Donald Trump, ahead of candidate Y, Kamala Harris.
So I remember very clearly in 2020, though, it wasn't as late of a night as it was in 2016 because we got to go home because they put a lid on it in places like Michigan and Georgia, which I thought was very, very odd. So we didn't get the numbers back that night. Do you think we're going to have the same thing, a protracted counting process? Because that also makes voters very skeptical. If they say, no, it's late, it's like, well, yes, you knew it was going to be late. That's like a doctor going home when a woman's in labor because she hasn't had the baby by 5 a.m.
I would say, look, the media doesn't count the vote. The media reports what the states and the counties are reporting about the vote. And so in the case of Michigan and Wisconsin and particularly Pennsylvania, it was a question of when are they going to finish the count and then report out the count so we can tell the public. In Pennsylvania, the law is that they cannot start processing mail-in ballots until Election Day. In other states, they can process them before. And by processing, I mean look at a ballot, it's in a sealed envelope, and realize this is Kennedy's ballot, so we can record, and she's a valid voter, and so we're going to put that aside. But that processing takes a long time to make sure, is this person registered and stuff. They can't do that until Tuesday morning. So they don't, and they can't count it until Tuesday night. And it's a very long process, and that's why Pennsylvania did not report last year, last time until Saturday morning. When we really knew that Biden had won Pennsylvania, and that's when we reported.
That's when you called the race.
And that's when we called the race. And so, to me, that's the over/under. Maybe they'll beat it this time. It'll be before that.
It seems like they could have a better process than that.
But they have not. You have to change the law to have a better process.
Yeah, that's up to them.
Yeah, it's up to the state.
And they should, because
I agree.
Don't go anywhere. More Kennedy Saves the World right after this.
Everything hinges on Pennsylvania. Would you agree with that?
There are very few paths for either of these candidates to get to the 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue without going through Philadelphia.
Wow. That's wild. I want to know about internal polling. And is internal polling, from what you know, very different from the polling that we see as news consumers?
Yes. The internal polling that each campaign is investing possibly 10% of their budgets in polling. They spend a lot more in polling than any media company has the ability to spend.
So you're talking about potentially $100 million.
Yes. And that they're spending on polling. And every night they are polling, they're getting a sample from every one of the battleground states and possibly more. And those polls tend to be more accurate. But guess what? They are totally confidential.
Why don't we have media polling like that?
Well, because it's a business and we like to make money. I mean,
of course.
So it's very costly.
Yeah.
And polls have become more and more expensive.
Oh,
and
so it's a matter of cost and efficiency for media companies like Fox News and ABC News and the New York Times to have that kind of polling that the campaigns have access to.
Yes.
Okay.
And
do they use different methods?
Typically not.
Okay.
I mean, one thing they sometimes look at different segments of the voters. I mean, I think the Republicans historically have been really good at saying these are the kinds of voters we need to hit and make sure we're getting. And so they don't really care how Democrats are responding. They care about, do we have a sufficient sample of Republicans, and are they giving me the kind of numbers I need for my candidate to win?
Are you surprised how the two candidates are responding to the polling that they're getting? Meaning the way their campaigns have shifted. Does it surprise you at all? So say Kamala Harris's poll numbers are going down among Black men and Latino voters and younger voters as well. Are you surprised that her campaign is not responding necessarily the way you would think they would?
I actually think that when I look at the schedules of the candidates, which is based entirely on polling, where do we need help, et cetera, and when I look at the messages they're giving, I think it's totally consistent with what the media polls are saying.
Okay.
Which is, number one, as you just mentioned, there appears to be some weakness with minority groups, particularly males. African American males and Hispanic males, and that's why you see them sending out Barack Obama to campaign. That's why you see a lot of That's why you see them going on Charlemagne the God, because they want to reach that group and try to hit their numbers higher.
Okay, so go ahead.
And I similarly, you don't see them spending a lot of time in Texas or New York, states that aren't battlegrounds. You see them spending time in the battleground states.
So I was reading recently analysis of that, and it was saying like Kamala Harris should have these groups shored up. You know,
Yes.
historically, these groups vote and perform very, very well for Democrats. And the fact that at this late stage in the election, she's still putting so much time and energy into certain voting blocks, it doesn't bode well for her because she can't go and make, you know, that critical last minute push in places like Wisconsin.
Well, she spent some time. They both spend time in Wisconsin. All of them spending time in Wisconsin. I think that's right. I think that what has been happening, what appears to be happening in the minority community, in terms of not that Trump's going to win either of those groups,
but he certainly
doing much
hasn't
better.
written them off like past Republicans.
Yeah,
I mean,
and-
you would not have seen Mitt Romney in a Bronx barbershop. I'm sorry. You wouldn't have seen it.
Well, to get a haircut.
No, there's absolutely no way Mitt Romney would have gone to a barbershop in the Bronx. And I think that's why Republicans have had.
Yeah, and we've seen that over the past couple of cycles, not just with Trump, but with other candidates, that Republicans are making some inroads into the minority communities, particularly the sort of minority communities without college degrees.
Yes. But it seems like Trump and Harris are making the same push to the same groups, which, you know, you could also say, well, if Trump isn't having to appeal to suburban white voters, he must be very comfortable with his internal polling. What specifically are you hearing about their internal polling?
The thing about the internal polling is, number one, it's really good. And number two, don't trust anything any campaign tells you about their internal polling.
Interesting.
Because they're only telling you stuff that is I'm not saying that they're not fibbing.
Yeah.
But they only release polls that are consistent with whatever message they're trying to release. So that's my general view of internal campaign
That's
polling.
pretty safe.
See it. Yeah.
Yeah, so we can't glean it because I was talking to one of Larry Kudlow's producers, and it was before Kamala sat down with Brett Baer, and she said her internal polling shows that she is not doing well. And he said, and this was just his gut, you're either 15 points up or you're 15 points down if you're sitting for an interview with Fox News at this point.
I would quibble with Kudlow's producer. I thought it was a shrewd move on Kamala's part because
I thought it was a necessary move. I mean, she had to do. She was being trolled and goaded to sit down with someone who, you know, wasn't The View.
Fair enough. But here's two things about that. Number one, I think that because I think that, as you put it, you know, suburban women and sort of Republicans who don't identify as part of the MAGA movement, the kind of people who wanted Nikki Haley to be the nominee.
Yes.
Those people are, I think, to a certain extent, the weak underbelly of the Trump campaign and a potential opportunity for the Harris campaign. And I think that they've been targeting that group for a while. The second thing I'd say about the Brett Baer versus The View is Mishkin's rule is gaffes only come from softball questions. And candidates always do better. It doesn't matter who the candidate is. They always do better with tough journalistic questions because, in a sense, they rise to the occasion. It's just like any other, you know, any sport. You run faster when your opponent runs a little
For sure.
is faster. And so I think it's always a mistake to just, you know, make sure the person is bubble wrapped and put them in friendly
I couldn't agree
audiences.
with you more. You know, it's like you're going to run faster in the Olympics than you would in a turkey trot.
Yeah.
And they have really been employing the turkey trot strategy.
Which was not shrewd. I
No.
mean, and it showed because they wouldn't allow Tim Walz to appear on any TV show, and he turns out to be a fine interviewer. And in the debate, it was like we sent out the ace reliever to debate without any kind of battle bullpen practice, and he did not do a good job against Vance.
Yeah, he looked like he had a cold arm.
Yeah, and on the other hand, since then he's been on a number of shows, including shows from sort of non-friendly anchors, and he's done just fine. And it's sort of, why didn't you have this guy out there before the debate?
Because she doesn't want to be outshone by anyone. And I think it betrays her lack of good political judgment.
Well, yeah. But I mean, candidates don't make those decisions. Those decisions are made by the campaign manager and the staff.
Then if that's the case, I think there's a lot of infighting in her campaign.
Something's
and
going
I think
wrong.
That's why you're seeing these wild kind of shifts in strategy in the 11th hour. It's because they cannot agree because they didn't have enough time with her as the candidate. And, it feels like they didn't have a quarterback who was like, this is how we're going to run this thing. We're going to get her into the end zone. And, there was a lot of infighting, and, it's great fodder for the other side. If she wins this thing, I think it'll be a miracle. What do you think?
Given everything I'm seeing right now, I'd say I'd much rather be Donald Trump than Kamala Harris.
How do you think it's going to go down on election night? Will it go down? Will we know on election night?
The over-under is Saturday. That's what I'm saying. I'm sticking to it. Don't put a gun to me until Saturday morning. We don't know exactly when it's going to be decided. Yeah. I think that the reality is this election, there are elections that sort of swing at the last minute to one side or the other, and that is clearly within the...
What would it take for this to break for her?
A gaffe on the other side. Mm-hmm. I think that's what's required.
But what can Donald Trump possibly say or do at this point that he hasn't done? I mean, that's one of the great benefits that he has, is he has said the most bat poop crazy stuff his entire adult life that I don't think, like, if the Access Hollywood tape didn't do it, I don't think there's anything he could say or do at this point that would shock, surprise, or change anyone's mind.
I think that's the probabilities are with you.
The only thing that really truly surprised people, from my perspective, was how well J.D. Vance did during the debate. I don't think a lot of people were expecting that. A lot of people, and I was one of them when he was chosen as the VP nominee, I was like, why this guy? And after seeing that, I was like, oh, that's the one thing he does well. That is his superpower.
He is a lawyer.
Yes.
A well-trained lawyer.
And, but he also out-Midwesterned Tim Walz. And he, it's like, oh, I pray for you and your family. Of course, Governor. And he was very deferential, which Walz wasn't expecting. And, I thought they were going to out-kind each other to death. All right, Arnon Mishkin. So this is it. All eyes are on the prize. And I feel like, do you think the Yankees have as good of a shot at winning the World Series as Donald Trump has at winning the presidency?
I'm a Met fan.
And there you have it. All right, Arnon. Great work. What you do is fascinating. I love talking to you about this stuff. I almost feel bad haranguing you, but because I know that you are so deep in it, especially this time of year and this time in the election cycle. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me, Kennedy.
Absolutely. The Fox News Decision Desk, the only place you need to be. This has been Kennedy Saves the World, along with Arnon Mishkin. I'm Kennedy.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.
Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.